The man at table 7 was about to be betrayed in a language he didn't understand. She did, and that was the problem. And trust me, nothing good ever begins that way. If you like stories where small moments change everything, you're in the right place. Click that subscribe button. Now most waitresses worry about tips, rude customers, or whether the kitchen is about to start a small war over missing orders. Reasonable fears. Manageable ones. She, unfortunately, had just overheard a murder being scheduled in fluent Korean, which was inconvenient. Not morally. Morality is expensive and rarely included in service jobs. Inconvenient because she had spent years carefully constructing a life where things like this no longer happened to her. A quiet life. A forgettable one. The emotional equivalent of beige. And she had worked very hard for that beige. The restaurant itself was built for illusions. Soft gold lighting, polished marble, conversations that stayed low. It depended heavily on people who did not exist. She was one of them. Black apron. Neutral lipstick, a name tag nobody ever read closely enough to remember. She moved between tables with the precision of someone who understood that attention was not neutral. Attention meant memory. And memory had a habit of reopening doors she had sealed shut with both hands. So she mastered the art of being forgettable. Not naturally. No one is born wanting to disappear. But life has a way of refining preferences. After enough loss, invisibility starts to feel less like erasure and more like strategy. Most nights it worked beautifully. Tonight it developed cracks. She noticed it in the air first. A tension that didn't belong to the restaurant's usual brand of curated calm. Not loud. Just a faint distortion beneath the surface, like a smile held a second too long. Then she heard the Korean. It slipped through the room cleanly, sharp enough to cut through the jazz and low laughter. Her body registered it before her mind did. That old buried instinct rising quietly, like muscle memory she had tried very hard to unlearn. She did not slow down. This part mattered. Survival is mostly pretending you haven't noticed things. People romanticize bravery, but invisibility pays better and lasts longer. She reached the table with a bottle of wine balanced carefully in her hand. 4 men. Expensive suits. The kind of posture that suggested they had never rushed for anything in their lives. Money sat at the table with them, not loudly, but unmistakably. It had a way of adjusting the air around it, and at the center of it, him. She noticed him last, which was impressive considering how difficult it was not to. He wasn't doing anything dramatic. No loud laughter, no dominating, no gestures. Just sitting there, elbows resting lightly on the table, fingers loosely linked, expression composed in a way that resisted easy reading. Not smiling, not cold, just contained. The dangerous ones often were. There was a particular stillness to him. Not passive, intentional. Like someone who understood that movement gave people something to measure, and he preferred not to be measured. She poured the wine carefully, eyes lowered the way they expected, see without staring, hear without reacting, leave no trace that you were ever part of the room's memory. That was the deal she had made with herself. And then the sentence came again. Calm, clean, efficient, a conclusion disguised as conversation. She understood every word. Of course she did. Life had a twisted sense of humor that way. You spend years outrunning a past, only for it to tap you gently on the shoulder while you're carrying a bottle of imported red. Inside her, something old shifted, not loudly. Trauma rarely storms, it seeps, slips through the smallest cracks and rearranges things quietly, like a thief who knows the layout of your house better than you do. She finished pouring and placed the bottle down with controlled precision. This was not her business. That part needed to be clear. She had learned that lesson the hard way, the kind of way that left scars in places no one could see, and a version of herself buried in a country she no longer spoke about. Interference had consequences, large ones, permanent ones. So she stepped back. 1 step, 2, almost free. And then instinct ruined everything. It was small, embarrassingly small, a fracture in the discipline she had spent years perfecting. She looked back, just once. Her eyes met his before she could stop them, and in that exact moment she understood she had made a mistake, because he was already looking at her. Not vaguely, not absently, directly. Like he had felt the weight of her attention before she even realized she was giving it. Up close his gaze felt sharper. Not aggressive, not curious in the usual way. Just steady. The kind of steady that suggested he was very used to noticing things other people preferred to miss. Which was unfortunate, because invisibility depends heavily on not being noticed by men like him. A small pause stretched between them. Thin, dangerous, elastic. She broke eye contact first. Of course she did. Survival had trained her reflexes well. Look away, move, continue. Leave no evidence that something had shifted. She turned. One step. Then, wait. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The word landed softly but carried weight, the way certain truths do when they don't bother announcing themselves loudly. She stopped, not willingly, reflexively. Some instincts outrank others, and the instinct to pause when power speaks, even quietly, is older than reason. Slowly she turned back. Closer now, his presence felt heavier, not physically imposing. Something subtler. A density that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with certainty. He studied her face for a moment longer than politeness allowed. Not rudely, carefully, like he was adjusting a theory. And then he asked, almost conversationally, "Did you understand what they said?" No thunder, no music swelling, no dramatic lighting shifts, just a question. Simple, precise, irreversible. Inside her, something small and final clicked into place. Because she understood, with sudden and brutal clarity, that whatever she said next would follow her for a very long time. And the worst part? She still hadn't decided which version of herself was about to answer. Now, here is the part where intelligent people lie. It's a very underrated survival skill. Lying politely, lying efficiently, lying just enough to exit a room with your life still arranged neatly around you. She had done it before. Reinvention is mostly a long series of well-timed lies stitched together with good posture. All she had to do was smile, shake her head, and continue being forgettable. Return to the safety of small talk and polished glasses. Return to the life she had built carefully, like stacking porcelain in an earthquake zone. Simple, elegant, responsible. Instead, she hesitated. A mistake. Hesitation is expensive in rooms like this. It stretches seconds into something visible, something measurable, something men who survive on instinct notice immediately. And he noticed, of course he did. Up close, his stillness felt less like calm and more like control. The kind earned, not inherited. The kind that suggested chaos had tried him before, and lost. He didn't repeat the question. That was the unsettling part. Most people rush to fill silence. They explain themselves, soften their tone, offer exits. He did none of that. He simply waited, gazed steady, as if time belonged to him and patience was just another asset in his portfolio. It made the air thinner, and suddenly she was aware of everything at once. The soft jazz still playing somewhere behind her, the weight of the tray in her hand, the faint scent of expensive cologne, dark and warm, cutting through the restaurant's curated neutrality. Too close. He was standing too close now, not touching, not invading. Just near enough that she could feel the gravity of him, the kind that rearranged breathing patterns without permission. Annoying. She hated noticing details like that. Sensory awareness was dangerous. It made moments vivid, and vivid moments had a habit of lingering long after logic left the room. "Did you understand what they said?" He asked again, softer this time, not pressing, clarifying. Which was worse, because now it felt less like interrogation and more like a door being held open. And she knew that door, on the other side, lived consequences. Memory stirred, unwelcome and precise. A winter she never revisited. A conversation she had once overheard and dismissed. A silence she had justified until it calcified into regret. The past has a cruel sense of timing. It never interrupts when you're strong, only when you're tired enough to listen. And she was tired. Tired of carrying ghosts that spoke fluent what if. So the truth slipped out. Not bravely, not dramatically, just honestly. Your translator is lying. And if you think that was the most dangerous part of the night, you're wrong, so you better subscribe to keep up. There it was. No thunderclap, no shattered glasses, just a sentence placed carefully between them, small and sharp as a blade folded into silk. And yet, the room changed. Not loudly. Subtly. The way pressure changes before a storm. Something invisible tightening across the table, stretching through the air, settling into the spaces between breaths. He didn't react immediately, he didn't explode, which is how you knew he was dangerous. Loud men react, dangerous ones adjust. That was the first sign he was dangerous. Loud men explode, reckless men shout, insecure men perform outrage like theater. He simply looked at her longer now, as if weighing not just the words but the architecture behind them. Truth has a structure, a shape, a rhythm, and people who have lived around betrayal long enough learn to recognize its silhouette. Something in her tone must have convinced him. Or maybe it was something else. Something quieter. Recognition, perhaps. The unsettling awareness of meeting someone who understood a language you never volunteered to teach. Without looking away from her, he switched to Korean. A short question. Casual, precise. Surgical. Across the table, the translator answered smoothly, too smoothly, and wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. Not enough for an amateur to catch. But wrong in the way a single off-note ruins an otherwise perfect song. A subtle distortion. But distortion was enough. She saw it happen in real time. The exact moment realization slid into place behind his eyes. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just a quiet recalibration. Like a lock adjusting internally after the correct key finally turns, and suddenly the space around the table felt colder. Not physically, conceptually. Because betrayal once confirmed changes the temperature of everything. He leaned back slightly, finally breaking eye contact with her. Not dismissively, strategically. As if her role in this particular equation had shifted from unknown variable to confirmed data point. The translator was still talking, still explaining, still smiling. Poor man. There are few lonelier experiences than continuing to lie after someone powerful realizes the truth. It's like performing on a stage where the audience has quietly left. She should have stepped away then. That would have been wise. Instead, she stayed. Just long enough to feel it. That shift. The one that happens when power reorients itself in a room. And then he looked at her again, differently this time. Not as staff, not as interruption, as something else entirely. Evidence, curiosity, possibility. It should have been alarming. It was. But beneath the alarm, something more complicated stirred. Something warmer, sharper, far less welcome. Awareness. The kind that travels along skin instead of logic. And for the first time that night, she made another mistake. She didn't look away immediately. It lasted less than a second. But in rooms like this, a second is a lifetime. Because something passed between them in that sliver of time. Unspoken, uninvited, entirely unwise. Not attraction, not yet. Something more dangerous. Recognition. The quiet understanding that the person standing in front of you is not background noise, not forgettable, not safe. And once recognition happens, anonymity rarely survives long after, which meant, whether she liked it or not, her quiet beige life had just developed a crack running straight through the center. There is a very specific kind of silence that follows exposed betrayal. It isn't loud, it doesn't shatter anything. No one gasps. No glasses fall dramatically to the floor. It simply settles. Heavy, intelligent, final. the kind of silence that rearranges loyalty without asking permission. The table behind him was still functioning in the technical sense. Words were being spoken, expressions carefully maintained, the fragile theater of normalcy attempting one last performance. But the illusion had already collapsed, and everyone who mattered knew it. She should have left. This was the moment sensible people stepped backward, lowered their gaze, and retreated into the protective anonymity of small tasks and smaller lives. Instead, she remained exactly where she was. Not boldly, not deliberately, just still, close enough to feel the aftermath ripple outward, close enough to understand something she hadn't planned to understand. Up close, power had a texture, and it was nothing like what people imagined. It wasn't loud dominance or cinematic menace. It was quieter than that, colder, more precise, like standing near deep water and realizing too late how far it went. He said something brief to the men at the table, calm, measured, final, a sentence that sounded like logistics but carried the weight of verdict. Then he stood, and that unfortunately changed everything, because sitting power is theoretical, standing power is real. He wasn't towering in any exaggerated way, but presence, she realized, had very little to do with height and everything to do with certainty. And he moved with the kind of certainty that suggested the world had adjusted itself around him more than once. The others remained seated. Of course they did. There is a subtle choreography to hierarchy that no one teaches you. You simply learn it by surviving enough rooms where breathing was dangerous. And now he was too close was dangerous. And now he was too close again. Close enough that she noticed things she absolutely did not want to notice. The faint warmth of his cologne, dark and restrained. Not loud, not sweet. Something quieter, something that suggested expensive decisions and sleepless nights. The precise way his suit fit, tailored without vanity, clean lines, no excess, details. Details were a problem, not because they mattered, because they lingered, and she had spent years training herself not to collect moments she couldn't afford to remember. "Walk with me," he said quietly, not a command. Which somehow made it worse, because commands are easy to resist. You either obey or you don't, but invitations from dangerous men tend to come wrapped in choices that are not really choices. She hesitated. A tiny pause, but he had already turned, slightly, not fully walking away, just shifting enough to suggest expectation. A small gesture, almost polite. And there it was again. Gravity. She should have refused. She knew that. Every instinct sharpened by history told her this was the exact kind of moment entire lives quietly derailed from. This was how it happened. Not explosions, not chaos. Just small, reasonable decisions that felt harmless at the time. One step, then another, and suddenly you were standing somewhere you never planned to be. Still, she moved. Not because she trusted him, because she trusted herself less. They stopped near a quieter corner of the restaurant, where the lighting softened further and conversations blurred into distant noise. Not private, but removed enough that words could exist without witnesses. He turned to face her fully now, closer than before. Too close for strangers, not close enough to be inappropriate, which was its own kind of calculation. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, something shifted again. Not outside, between. Up close, his face was harder to misread. Not cold, as she had first assumed, just disciplined, like someone who had learned early that emotions, once visible, became leverage in the wrong hands. There was tiredness there, too. Faint, carefully hidden, the kind that doesn't come from lack of sleep, but from accumulation. Years stacking quietly behind the eyes. She hated noticing that. Human details complicated things. Complication was dangerous. "You're not staff," he said finally. Not a question, an observation. And just like that, her pulse shifted. Because there it was, recognition evolving. The next stage, she tilted her head slightly. I'm wearing the uniform. A mistake. Humor. Humor created familiarity. Familiarity created proximity. Proximity created memory. And memory, in situations like this, was a liability. Something flickered in his expression. Not quite. Amusement. But close enough to be unsettling. Uniforms lie, he said, softly. The words landed differently than they should have. Not flirtation, not accusation. Something in between. And now the air felt thinner. She should have stepped back. She didn't. Which was how she realized the most dangerous truth of the evening. She wasn't just responding anymore. She was participating. He studied her again, slower this time. Not scanning. Reading. As if the answer to a question he hadn't voiced yet was written somewhere along her posture, her stillness, the way she held her shoulders like someone accustomed to leaving rooms quickly. "Where did you learn Korean?" he asked. There it was. The real question. Not about language, about history. She felt it immediately, the familiar tightening beneath her ribs, that quiet internal resistance that rose whenever someone stepped too close to a version of her she had worked very hard to bury. There were easy answers available: travel, school, an ex-boyfriend with complicated hobbies, convenient lies, polished ones, socially acceptable ones. But he was still looking at her like that. Steady, patient, unrushed, and something about that patience made lying feel heavier than usual. So she chose the smallest truth she could survive. I lived there. The words sat between them, fragile but intact. She did not elaborate, would not elaborate, because if she did, the story would not stop at geography. It would spill into winters and departures and the quiet brutality of starting over with less than you arrived with. But something in her tone must have carried more than the sentence allowed, because he didn't push. He simply held her gaze, and for the first time that night, the silence between them felt less like tension and more like understanding's darker cousin. Recognition again, stronger now, closer. And she realized with a slow, unwelcome clarity that this was no longer just about a lie at a table. Something else had begun, something quieter, far more dangerous, because the real risk was no longer the truth she had told. It was the way he was looking at her now, like she was no longer background. And once you stop being background in the life of a man like him, you rarely return to it unchanged. There is a point in certain conversations where the air changes texture. Not dramatically. No lightning, no orchestral swell. Just a subtle shift. The kind that tells you something irreversible has already begun, even if neither person has said the sentence that proves it yet. They were standing inside that moment now. Close enough that distance felt theoretical. Close enough that silence stopped feeling empty and started feeling loaded. He didn't look away. That was the first problem. Most people, when faced with something unfamiliar, glance away instinctively. It's a small social mercy, a way of returning strangers to safety. He didn't offer that mercy. He held her gaze with the same calm focus he had used at the table, except now it was undiluted. No witnesses, no distractions, just attention, direct and unfiltered. Attention like that does something to a person. It rearranges things. She felt it immediately. That quiet internal shift she had spent years learning to avoid. The subtle destabilization that came from being seen too clearly by someone who had no right to see you at all. Dangerous. Not because of him, because of what recognition does to memory. "You shouldn't have told me," he said quietly, not accusing, observing, and somehow that made it heavier. She exhaled slowly. "I know." Another mistake. Agreement creates intimacy faster than touch ever could. For a moment, neither of them spoke again. The restaurant continued around them, blissfully unaware. Glasses clinked. Someone laughed too loudly across the room. Cutlery brushed porcelain in soft, forgettable rhythms. Normal life, continuing stubbornly. But here, in this small pocket of altered gravity, normal had already left. He studied her a second longer, then asked, "Why did you—" There it was, the only question that mattered, not about language, not about the lie, not about the table or the men or the quiet violence threaded through the evening. Motive. The thin line between accident and intention. She should have deflected, a joke, a shrug, something light enough to dissolve the weight gathering between them. Instead, honesty arrived again, uninvited, persistent, because some truths don't wait for permission. They surface the moment silence loosens its grip. She looked away briefly, not to escape him, but to steady herself. The polished floor reflected fractured gold light back at her, distorted and shimmering. Then she said softly, "Because I understood it. Not enough." He didn't move, but she felt the stillness deepen, so she finished it. "And I know what it sounds like when no one warns you." There. The real answer. It left her before she could edit it. Too raw, too close to the bone. The kind of sentence that carried history inside it whether you wanted it to or not. And just like that, something in his expression shifted. Subtly. But undeniably. Not pity, never that. Something rarer. Recognition stripped of distance. For the first time that night, he looked less like a man evaluating a situation and more like someone remembering something he had once decided to forget. It passed quickly. People like him don't linger in vulnerable spaces. They visit, briefly, then seal the doors behind them. Still, the damage was done. The air between them had changed permanently. He glanced toward the table briefly, not with concern but calculation, then back at her. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a different weight. "I could use someone who understands things before they're said." The words were simple. The implications were not. There it was. The offer, not dressed up, not romanticized, just placed between them like a quiet contract, waiting for a signature. A job, technically, but not really. It was proximity, access, orbit. She felt it immediately. That pull. Not safety, gravity. Men like him didn't step into lives. They rearranged them, slowly, thoroughly, permanently. She had seen it before. Lived it. Barely survived it. And suddenly she was aware of how close they were standing. How easy it would be to say yes. How small the distance was between the life she had rebuilt and the one that might replace it entirely. Temptation rarely arrives looking like ruin. It arrives looking like inevitability. "I can't," she said. The words came out quieter than she intended. Not sharp, not defensive, final. He didn't react immediately, which meant he was listening carefully. Good listeners were the most dangerous kind. "Can't," he repeated softly. Not questioning. Testing. She met his gaze again, and this time there was no hesitation in it, no flicker of uncertainty, just the steady clarity of someone choosing a scar over a risk. "Men like you don't enter quietly," she said, "and I've already rebuilt once." It was more than she had planned to give him, less than the full truth, but enough. Enough for him to understand that this refusal wasn't about disinterest. It was about history. For a moment, something almost like amusement touched the corner of his mouth. Not mockery, something quieter, stranger, respect maybe, or recognition of a familiar wound. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, as if acknowledging a move in a game neither of them had agreed to play, but both understood anyway. Then, after a pause that stretched just long enough to matter, he asked the question that would follow her long after this night ended. "Why warn me?" Not suspicious, not grateful. Curious. And curiosity, she knew, was always the beginning of something. She should have lied. A clean exit, a forgettable answer. Something that would let this moment dissolve harmlessly into the rest of the evening. But she was tired. Tired of elegant evasions. Tired of carrying truths that had nowhere to land. So she told him the one thing she had never said out loud before. "Because nobody warned me." The sentence settled between them, fragile, and irreversible. No drama, no echo. Just truth, laid bare in the quietest way possible. And for the first time since she had met him, he didn't look powerful. He looked still. Not frozen, just still. Like something inside him had shifted slightly off its axis. It only lasted a second. People like him recover quickly. But seconds matter. Seconds change trajectories. She stepped back first. Smart, because moments like this had a way of expanding if you let them breathe too long. They deepened, complicated, turned into things that refused to stay contained inside memory. Distance returned slowly, reluctantly, like a tide pulling away from shore. I should get back to work, she said. A mundane sentence, a fragile bridge back to normal life. He didn't stop her, didn't reach out, didn't insist, didn't do anything dramatic at all. Which somehow made leaving harder. She turned and walked away before that thought could fully form. Step by step, the restaurant folded back around her, noise returning, light softening, the illusion of ordinary life reassembling itself piece by careful piece. But something had shifted, irrevocably. She could feel it in the quiet hum beneath her ribs, that subtle awareness that arrives after certain encounters, the kind that lingers long after logic insists nothing has changed. Across the room, she could feel his gaze follow her. Not possessive, not demanding, just present. And that, more than anything, unsettled her, because attention fades, desire fades. Even danger fades eventually. But recognition has a habit of waiting, and returning when you least expect it. And that's the thing about recognition. People think it's harmless. A glance, a moment, a coincidence. It's not. Recognition is where stories stop being safe. If stories like this stay with you, subscribe. And tell me, would you have warned him